Good evening, community. It is a true pleasure to be with you once again, bringing you the most macabre and terrifying stories that reach us every week. If you would like to send in your story, our email is in the video description. We thank each person who continues to share their stories with us. Now, I invite you to turn off the lights and put on your headphones if you can. The most important thing is for you to let yourself be carried away by the upcoming stories. In the heart of a region forgotten by time, there was a village where tranquility reigned, but also where the shadows of ancient legends moved silently among the houses. The streets were narrow, flanked by centuries-old trees whose canopies intertwined, forming green tunnels that seemed to hide secrets older than the land itself. There, the sun set slowly, painting the sky with the colors of a past that was never fully left behind. The villagers, simple people of few words, lived their lives with a certain melancholy, as if they carried the weight of the stories told by their grandparents and great-grandparents. Stories that were not merely entertainment, but warnings. No one in the village dared to question these narratives that spoke of vengeful spirits, creatures that roamed the woods, and above all, the ancient well. The well, situated right in the center of the main square, was more than just an old stone structure. It was the guardian of a mystery that no one wished to unravel. They said the well had been there long before the first inhabitant arrived, perhaps even before the trees that surrounded the village had taken root. No one knew who built it or why, but everyone knew the one indisputable truth. Under no circumstances should anyone ever look inside it. The legends were clear. Anyone foolish enough to disobey this warning and dare to peer into the darkness of the well would never be the same again. Some said that those who did so disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the very darkness they sought. Others claimed that they remained, but with empty stares, as if part of their soul had been sucked into the depths of the well, leaving only an empty shell behind. As the years passed, the elders decided it would be best to seal the well, hiding it beneath a heavy stone lid, as if this could contain the malevolence that dwelled there. Vegetation took over the place, covering it like a shroud, in the hope that time would erase it from the village's memory. But the stories continued to be told, whispered at night around the fires, where children listened with wide eyes, and the adults, despite feigning skepticism, felt a shiver run down their spines. It was a place where fear hid in the shadows of everyday life, where past and present intertwined, and where the legends were not just words, but living warnings, as real as the wind that blew through the trees at night, carrying with it the whispers of those who dared to challenge the unknown. Despite the warnings, the temptation of the unknown was something the village youth could not resist. At that age, we all believed ourselves to be invincible, viewing the legends as nothing more than tales meant to scare children. It was this youthful arrogance that led us to do what no sane person would dare. During a stifling summer, while we searched for any kind of amusement, Philip, always the most daring, suggested that we visit the well on the next full moon, just to see if the stories were true. Michael laughed nervously, but soon everyone was convinced, including Clara, usually the voice of reason. Laughing at the superstitions, we agreed to meet in the square on the appointed night. The days leading up to that night passed in a blur, a mix of anticipation and nervousness. When the full moon finally arrived, brighter and colder than any before, we knew there was no turning back. We met in the square in silence, with Philip leading the way, defiant. "Let's see what's inside this well," he said, and in that moment, we forgot the warnings and the fear. The temptation of the unknown had won. We walked together towards the well, hearts racing, certain that we were ready to face whatever might be hidden inside. Or at least, that's what we thought. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting long, sinister shadows over the sleeping village. As we approached the well, the silence was broken only by the muffled sound of our footsteps. A sense of dread weighed heavily on our hearts, as if we knew we were about to cross a point of no return. When we reached the square, the well stood as it always had, an ancient structure covered by a stone lid, half hidden by vegetation. Philip, trying to maintain his courage, was the first to approach, holding the lantern with slightly trembling hands. "Let's get this over with," he said, but his voice betrayed the fear we all felt. With the help of Michael, who had brought a lever, we managed to move the heavy stone lid. As the darkness was revealed, a putrid smell, like something rotten, rose from the well, causing us to instinctively recoil. Philip leaned over the opening, trying to see what was hidden down below. Suddenly, Philip's face twisted in pure terror. Before we could react, an invisible force violently pulled him into the well. His desperate scream echoed through the night, and then oppressive silence fell upon us. We were paralyzed, unable to comprehend what had just happened. We tried in vain to rescue him, throwing ropes and stones into the well, but all we received in return was the sound of our own despair echoing back. The well seemed like a bottomless abyss, swallowing not just Philip, but our hope as well. I tried to look inside myself, but felt a malevolent presence that wanted to drag me in too. It was then that I heard a faint whisper, Philip's distorted voice pleading for help, as if coming from a place beyond this world. With trembling hands and the help of the others, we covered the well again, trying to close the door on that nightmare. However, we knew it wouldn't end there. As we walked away, it became clear that the night had revealed something that should never have been disturbed. The horror of that experience marked us forever, and what we lost in the well was much more than our friend Philip. That night, as we walked away from the well, we felt that something inside us had been broken. The initial fear morphed into a persistent terror, taking deep root in our minds. Back at Michael House, we locked ourselves in silence, unable to process what we had witnessed. Clara, once so cheerful, was pale and distant, while Joaquin trembled uncontrollably. I felt as if the darkness of the well was now inside me, growing with each passing minute. We tried to make sense of what had happened, but nothing seemed logical. Whatever was in that well wasn't a legend, but a perverse reality far beyond our understanding. When we attempted to tell the adults, no one believed us. Back at the well, everything was as it had been, as if Philip had never existed. The village continued its routine, but soon strange things began to happen. Animals disappeared, inexplicable sounds echoed at night, and shadows were seen near the well. Over time, Philip was never found, and we drifted apart. Joaquin vanished without a trace, and Clara became a shadow of her former self, avoiding any contact. Michael and I tried to move on, but the well seemed to call to us whenever we passed the square, whispering promises we feared to hear. The evil we had awakened was no longer contained. It seeped into our lives, transforming everything around us. One silent night, I heard Philip's voice again, or something pretending to be him, calling my name from the well. I knew it wasn't my friend anymore, but a dark presence that fed on our fear and guilt. Despite our efforts to seal the well, the evil would never be fully contained. It was waiting, biding its time, ready for the next victim. As time passed, the village was slowly consumed by terror instead of recovering. The darkness from the well seemed to spread like a disease, affecting everything around it. At first, small events like the disappearance of animals and the impoverishment of the fields were easy to ignore. But at night, the true horror manifested in strange whispers and shadows that seemed to come alive. Fear took deep root in the villagers. People spoke less, laughed less, and no one dared to go out after sunset. Among us who had been there that night, the impact was even deeper. Joaquin disappeared, unable to bear the terror. Clara, once full of life, became a mere shadow of herself, haunted by what she had witnessed. Michael and I tried to move on, but the well seemed to call to us silently. The feeling that something terrible still awaited at the bottom of the well never left us. Years later, driven by an inexplicable force, I found myself walking towards the well under a full moon. The lid, which should have been in place, was slightly askew. With trembling hands, I pushed it aside, revealing a faint light at the bottom. To my horror, I realized that something was moving in the darkness. It was Philip, or what was left of him. His face was pale, his eyes were empty voids, and his distorted voice called for help, but not as a plea, rather as a trap. Terror overwhelmed me, and I stepped back, leaving the well in silence once again. That night, I knew that the evil we had awakened would never sleep again. It was there, waiting, and one day it would find a new victim. When that happened, the horror would return, and there would be no escape. The evil had been unleashed, and all we could do was wait. Years had passed since that night when I saw Philip at the bottom of the well, but the image of his pale face and empty eyes never left me. The village remained under a constant shadow, with strange sounds and dancing shadows that had become part of our daily lives. I tried to move on, but the weight of that night never left me, and every time I passed by the square, I felt the dark urge to look into the well, though I avoided it, knowing my life depended on it. Michael, the only one who remained by my side, also bore the burden of that night. We never spoke about the well or Philip, desperately trying to pretend everything was normal. But on a cold full moon night, the call came again. Help me. Philip's distorted voice pulled me back into the nightmare I had tried to forget, forcing me to walk to the well. When I arrived, the stone lid was displaced, and a dark energy pulsed from the well. Though I knew I shouldn't, driven by an inexplicable force, I pushed the lid aside and looked inside. This time, there was no light, only absolute darkness. From the depths, something moved, a grotesque shadow slowly approaching. It was a twisted parody of what Philip had been, with empty eyes and a skeletal hand reaching out for help. Terror gripped me, but somehow I managed to pull back as the shadow dissolved into the darkness. I closed the well again, but I knew it was futile. The evil we had awakened would never be contained again. The final call had been made, and the well, at some point, would seek another soul to feed its darkness. In the darkness of my room, I still heard one last whisper, almost inaudible, yet impossible to ignore. Help me. I knew that one day I would have to return to the well, but I wasn't sure if, this time, I would come back out. After the final night when Philip's whisper faded away, the village sank into a deep, oppressive silence. The darkness seemed thicker, saturating the air with the evil we had awakened. The well was sealed again with chains and stones, but we knew it was only a temporary measure, a postponement of the inevitable. The few remaining villagers avoided the square, and the well, once the center of social life, became a dead place, heavy with fear. Clara left the village, transformed into a shadow of her former self. Joaquin never returned, and Michael distanced himself, unable to bear the memory of what we had done. I stayed, knowing that the well still called to me, that the evil was alive, waiting. Over time, the village emptied, and those who remained learned to live with the fear. The square, once full of life, became a place of shadows and whispers of a past that would not be forgotten. I knew my time was running out, that the well's call was becoming more insistent, and that eventually I would have to face it again. On the final night, I found myself standing before the well, knowing that the chains and stones were an illusion of safety. The well was waiting for its next sacrifice. I looked inside, aware that the curse would never leave me and that the cycle would repeat. I returned home knowing that the village was doomed and that the evil would never be defeated, only delayed. As long as I lived, the curse would live with me, waiting to be unleashed again. When the last candle flickered out and the last door closed, all that remained was the silence and the well waiting in the darkness. Imagine a place where the world seems to have stopped, where time moves slowly, like a river barely visible in its flow. It was in search of this peace, this isolation, that he decided to leave behind the bustle of the city and move to his grandparents' house, nestled in a remote mountain range. There, among mountains that rose like sharp teeth against the sky, he hoped to find the refuge he so desperately sought. The road to the village was winding, flanked by dense forests where sunlight barely penetrated. The farther he drove, the more the modern world seemed to fade away, giving way to a landscape unchanged for centuries. When he finally arrived at the village, he was greeted by an unsettling silence, a kind of stillness that seemed to guard ancient secrets, murmured by the trees and whispered by the wind. The few remaining houses, old and weathered by time, were scattered along dirt roads. The villagers were few, their faces marked by years of hard life and a melancholy that seemed to be part of the place. No one spoke much to him upon his arrival, offering only discreet glances and silent nods. But he sensed that there was more behind those looks, something they didn't dare to speak. The grandparents' house, his new home, was a sturdy wooden structure built by their own hands. The walls creaked with every passing breeze, as if the house were alive, breathing in unison with the surrounding mountains. There was a sense of warmth, but also something indefinable, an almost tangible presence that he couldn't quite understand. In the first days, he explored the surroundings, trying to adjust to the village's slow pace. The fresh mountain air was invigorating, and he felt grateful to be far from the relentless noise of the city. But there was something in the mountains, something in the dark woods and towering peaks, that seemed to watch him, something he couldn't define, but that made him feel small, insignificant, as if he were trespassing on territory that did not belong to him. As the days passed, he began to notice that the village had its own rhythms and rules, different from anything he had known. Night fell early, like a heavy cloak draped over the land, and the villagers retreated indoors early, closing their doors and windows in haste, as if protecting themselves from something he still didn't understand. It was as if the village itself were under the watch of an invisible force, a presence that inhabited the darkness. He didn't know it yet, but his arrival had awakened more than just memories in those who still lived there. There was something in the mountains, something that had always been there, waiting, and now it was beginning to stir. In the first days in the village, he noticed that people spoke little but observed much. The neighbors were cordial, but their words were brief and almost whispered, as if they feared that the very air might betray their secrets. Soon, he began to hear fragments of old legends, always mentioned in hushed tones, especially about the Nahual. The Nahual was a recurring theme in conversations, treated with both respect and fear. The villagers described it as an ancient creature that could take the form of any animal, a spirit connected to the forces of the earth and shadows. While he dismissed these stories as mere superstitions, something about the way the villagers spoke of the Nahual made him uneasy, as if they were speaking of something real that had already affected their lives. Despite the warnings, he remained skeptical, believing these tales to be nothing more than folklore. However, as the nights grew longer and the silence more oppressive, he began to suspect that there might be something more behind these legends, something he didn't yet understand, but that was there, waiting, watching. Each day, he felt he was drawing closer to a truth he would rather not know. As the weeks passed, the sense of isolation he had sought began to transform into something darker. The nights in the village were silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was an oppressive silence that concealed something invisible, yet intensely felt. Small things started to happen, chills down his spine, a sensation of being watched, especially when he looked out the windows and saw only darkness. During the day, he tried to distract himself, but as the afternoon wore on, he increasingly felt as though he were being observed, as if the forest surrounding him was alive and waiting for him to let his guard down. Determined to confront his fear, he ventured into the forest, but the atmosphere around him changed. He found deep marks on the ground, footprints unlike any known animal, as if made by something heavy, something that was hunting. The fear intensified, and he hurried back to the cabin, but the feeling of being watched persisted. That night, he locked everything more carefully, but sleep eluded him. The footprints, the clearing, and the invisible presence lingered in his mind, causing him to question his skepticism. Perhaps the legends about the Nahual were more than just stories. That night, with the wind howling and the full moon rising, he felt that something was about to happen. The heavy air and the constant feeling of being watched unsettled him. Inside the cabin, the silence was broken by a strange sound, almost a whisper that seemed to come from all directions. Against his better judgment, he grabbed a lantern and went outside to investigate. In the clearing, he found a coyote, but something was wrong. The animal's fur was black, absorbing the light, and its eyes, human and malevolent, stared at him intensely. When the coyote grinned grotesquely, he realized he was facing the Nahual, the creature of legends he had dismissed. Overcome with fear, he ran through the forest, hearing the Nahual chasing him with unnatural speed. When he could run no more, he collapsed in a clearing. The Nahual appeared again, now in a humanoid form, its eyes gleaming with malice. The creature approached slowly, and before he could react, he felt claws tearing into his back. Everything went dark as he was consumed by the abyss. He woke up in the darkness, exhausted and disoriented, with a sharp pain in his back where the narwhal had wounded him. Still in the clearing, he felt vulnerable and alone, with the sensation that the creature was still lurking nearby. With great effort, he forced himself to stand and began walking toward the cabin, knowing he couldn't stay there. Each step was a battle against pain and fear, as the forest around him seemed denser and more threatening. The once familiar path had turned into a labyrinth, and he knew the narwhal could strike at any moment. The pain in his back grew worse, carrying the weight of a mark left by the creature, something he sensed would change his life forever. When he finally reached the cabin, he collapsed onto the floor, knowing he was not truly safe. The scar on his back burned, not just as a physical wound, but as a sign that he had been touched by something beyond human understanding. He curled up in bed, trembling with cold and fear, aware that even inside the cabin, the narwhal was still watching him. The battle was far from over. The fight for survival had only just begun. When dawn finally arrived, he woke, but relief did not follow. His body ached, especially in his back, where the scar left by the narwhal burned like fire. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized his reflection. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and the scar on his back was a grim symbol of his encounter with the creature. He decided to seek help in the village, but when he arrived, he realized that the villagers knew exactly what had happened. Their silent gazes revealed that they all lived with the same fear, accepting the narwhal as a part of their lives. Without answers, he returned to the cabin, but peace was out of reach. The scar seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy, and the constant nightmares of the narwhal pushed him to the brink of insanity. As the days passed, he felt his connection to the world slipping away. The pain and the scar were his only constants, and he began to understand that the narwhal was now a part of him, a curse from which he could not escape. Resigned, he accepted that, although he was still alive, the life he had known had ended in that clearing, under the cold light of the full moon. The days in the village grew increasingly dark, and he knew that the mark of the narwhal would never disappear. It wasn't just the scar on his back, but something deeper that had taken root in his soul. Feeling trapped in a web of fear, he decided to leave, though with sadness, abandoning his grandparents' home, which now seemed haunted by memories he wished to forget. On the foggy morning of his departure, the villagers watched from a distance, understanding that his leaving was inevitable. As he walked away from the village, he realized that the presence of the narwhal hadn't stayed behind, but was now a part of him. Even in the city, surrounded by people, he felt the shadow of the creature lurking, haunting him in his nightmares. He resigned himself to living with constant fear, knowing that the narwhal would never leave him in peace. The scar on his back burned with every full moon, a reminder that his life had changed forever. As the days passed, he became more isolated, consumed by the presence of the narwhal, understanding that the battle hadn't ended in the clearing. The creature had stolen his peace, his sanity, and his soul. Accepting that his life was bound to the narwhal, he walked the streets of the city, knowing that the creature's darkness would follow him until the end of his days. Under the full moon, he recognized that the fear he felt was shared by all those marked by the narwhal, condemned never to find peace. In a remote corner of the world, there was a small village, forgotten by time, where the weathered wooden houses and ancient stone walls seemed to whisper stories that no one dared to speak aloud. The village lived under the shadow of an imposing hill, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to guard something hidden at its summit. The villagers spoke little of the place, fearing that their words might awaken something long dormant. Everyone knew the tale of a healer who had lived on the edge of the forest centuries ago. When the crops failed and livestock fell ill, the villagers accused her of witchcraft and burned her at the top of the hill. Before she died, she cursed the village, vowing that no one would find peace until her soul was avenged. Since then, the hill had been avoided, as it was said that the witch's whispers could be heard at night, and some claimed to have seen a shadowy figure among the trees. Those who dared to venture there returned changed, unable to speak of what they had seen. The hill became a constant reminder of the village's dark past. Time passed, but the story was never forgotten. Children were warned to stay away from the hill, while some dismissed the legends as mere superstition. However, everyone knew that the hill held something that waited patiently to be revealed. And those who dared to challenge that place might discover that the legends were, in fact, warnings. He arrived in the village seeking a quiet place to start anew, knowing little about the area and carrying an arrogance that made him dismiss superstitions. The villagers welcomed him warmly, but he soon noticed the strange silence that fell whenever the hill was mentioned. In the first few weeks, he adapted to life in the village, but one night, when he heard the story of the hill for the first time, his curiosity was instantly piqued. An older villager mentioned the legend of the witch who had cursed the village before being burned on the hill. Though the others avoided the topic, the young man, skeptical and fascinated by mysteries, insisted on learning more, convincing himself that it was all just foolish superstition. Determined to climb the hill, he believed he could prove that there was nothing real about the stories. Driven by curiosity and disbelief, he prepared for the adventure, grabbing a lantern and a coat, and set off toward the trail that led to the hill. Ignoring the slight chill he felt as he glanced back, he began the ascent, unaware that he was about to awaken something ancient and dangerous. The darkness on the hill was different from the darkness in the village. As he began the ascent, he noticed that the narrow path was swallowed by a shadow that even the moonlight couldn't penetrate. The lantern barely illuminated the ground in front of him, and the silence around him grew heavier, as if the hill itself was watching him. As he climbed higher, a growing sense of unease gripped him. The air turned colder, and he noticed strange, subtle changes. The leaves on the trees didn't rustle with the wind, and a cold breeze seemed laden with something sinister. He began to hear soft whispers that grew louder, surrounding him, sending chills up his spine. The lantern started to flicker, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Panic began to set in when he heard a distinct sound, like branches snapping, but he saw nothing. The feeling of being watched became unbearable, and he realized that something was deeply wrong on the hill. Shadows started to appear at the edges of his vision, and he heard a low, malicious laugh that made him freeze with fear. He broke into a run, desperate to escape the hill, but it felt as though he was getting no closer to the top. Each step seemed to pull him deeper into the darkness, and he knew that something was following him, something that should never have been awakened. As he ran, the hill seemed to stretch endlessly, with the whispers and laughter echoing in his mind. When he finally reached the summit, the true terror began. At the top, an ancient circle of stones marked the spot where, according to legend, the witch had been burned. The air was thick and oppressive, and a growing panic seized him, but he couldn't move. Suddenly, a low moan broke the silence, followed by a thick fog around the stone circle. A specter with empty, furious eyes emerged, the witch, or what remained of her. With a cruel smile, she muttered incomprehensible words, making it clear he would pay for invading her territory. Paralyzed by fear, he couldn't move or scream as she floated toward him, overwhelming him with terror. Just before losing consciousness, he saw her twisted smile grow impossibly wide, and then everything went black. When he awoke, he was lying next to the stone circle, drenched in cold sweat. Though the witch had vanished, he felt her presence in every shadow around him. Trembling, he stood and began his descent down the hill, knowing he would never be the same. The darkness felt thicker, and the whispers were now in his mind. He realized that, while he had physically escaped, the witch's mark would haunt him forever. As he reached the village, it felt like a different world, but he knew what he had experienced was real. The legend of the witch wasn't just a story, and her curse was true. He had awakened something that should never have been disturbed. With his mind a whirlwind of fear, he began his descent down the hill, driven by sheer survival instinct. With every step, he felt the witch's presence, like a shadow pursuing him. The trees around him seemed to watch, and the wind whispered maliciously. The treacherous terrain caused him to stumble and fall, as if the hill itself was mocking his attempt to escape. The darkness around him distorted reality, and the shadows took on fleeting shapes that vanished the moment he tried to focus on them. He knew he was being hunted by something unseen, and felt the weight of the witch's curse tightening around his heart. Visions of pale, desperate figures appeared before him, trying to warn him, but their words were lost to him. Disoriented, he ran in circles, as if the hill was toying with him, keeping him trapped. But then he saw a faint light in the distance, a floating lantern that seemed to be his only link to reality. Clinging to the sight of the lantern with all his strength, he managed to reach the base of the hill. The lantern vanished as he stepped onto the path leading back to the village. Though he had escaped physically, he felt something had changed within him. As he ran back to the village, he sensed that something invisible was following him, a mark of the witch's curse that he would carry for the rest of his days. When he finally reached the village, exhausted and shaken, the contrast between the familiar surroundings and the horror he had experienced on the hill felt surreal. The houses were calm, but he knew the terror from the hill had followed him. Trembling, he entered his home and locked the door, but found no relief. His mind was tormented by the image of the witch, and sleep eluded him. When he finally drifted off, he was haunted by repetitive nightmares. The next morning, as he ventured outside, he noticed the villagers watching him with furtive glances, keeping their distance and murmuring among themselves. It was clear that the witch's curse was spreading. In the days that followed, strange occurrences began. Dead animals, withering crops, and children who were once lively, now quiet and distant. The village began to fracture under the weight of fear and mistrust, and he knew it was his doing. He tried to explain what had happened on the hill, but no one wanted to listen. Isolated and marked by the witch, he watched helplessly as the village was consumed by the curse he had awakened. The nights continued to be plagued by nightmares, and the whispering voices he had heard on the hill could now be heard in the streets. People swore they saw shadowy figures wandering among the houses. He began to avoid leaving his home, fearing both the villagers' wary eyes and the shadows that seemed to follow him. He spent his days watching as the village slowly disintegrated, consumed by the curse. He knew there was no way to undo what he had done, and guilt and despair grew within him as the village became a shadow of what it once was, under the vengeful gaze of the witch he had awakened. The days in the village dragged on, and the once lively place had become a shadow of its former self. The streets were deserted, and the few villagers who ventured out did so with haste and fear. He, marked by the hill and the legend of the witch, felt the weight of guilt and was shunned by all. The guilt gnawed at him, and his home, once a refuge, had become a prison. The nightmares of the witch and the hill haunted him, and the darkness within his mind gave him no respite. He realized that the witch's curse had taken root deeply within him and the village. The isolation and guilt became unbearable, and he decided that he had to do something to try to undo what he had caused. One night, he took his lantern and headed back toward the hill, determined to offer his life to save the others. When he reached the summit, he knelt in the circle of stones, waiting for whatever might come. But the witch did not appear. It was then that he understood the curse could not be undone by a simple sacrifice. The witch would let him live, trapped in his own mind, haunted by what he had unleashed, knowing that the curse would follow him forever. Resigned, he descended the hill for the last time, aware that the village was doomed and that he would carry the burden of guilt until the end of his days. The hill, the witch, and the curse had become part of him, a shadow that would never leave.
The village's old wooden bridge, worn and creaking, spanned a river that was once strong but had since dwindled to a mere stream. More than just a structure, the bridge was the center of a dark legend. Years ago, a school bus fell off the bridge during a storm, and the children on board were tragically swallowed by the river. Since then, the bridge had become a haunted place, avoided by the villagers at night, who believed the children's whispers could still be heard. A young park ranger, newly assigned to patrol the area, arrived in the village. Skeptical and confident, He didn't believe the stories about the bridge. On his first patrol, the bridge seemed calm, but as darkness fell, something changed. He began to hear soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to be carried by the wind. Although he tried to ignore them, the whispers continued to follow him, causing him increasing discomfort. That night, as he left the bridge, he felt a weight on his chest and the sensation that something was watching him. The whispers continued to echo in his mind, turning the legend of the Bridge of Whispers into a disturbing reality that he couldn't ignore. Thus, the mystery of the bridge began to unfold, and he realized he was destined to uncover its secrets, whether he wanted to or not. As the days passed, he grew accustomed to the routine of patrolling the area around the bridge. During the day, the forest offered tranquility, but at night, the atmosphere changed, and the bridge took on an oppressive presence. One of those nights, the whispers returned, clearer and more insistent, as if the invisible voices were trying to communicate. Standing in the middle of the bridge, he heard a strange child's laughter, causing his heart to race. Looking down, he saw small childlike footprints in the mud, slowly advancing towards him, but there was no one there. When he tried to approach, the footprints disappeared, leaving him with a deep feeling of unease. In the following days, the strange phenomena continued. Objects moved out of place, and his flashlight was found turned off in the middle of the path, although he was sure he had left it elsewhere. The whispers followed him constantly, never completely ceasing. The bridge, once a simple crossing point, had become a place of mystery and unrest. He began to question whether the old legends were more than superstition, feeling increasingly uncomfortable and certain that something invisible yet real was watching him, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was a moonless night, and the forest was plunged into absolute darkness. During his patrol, he again heard the whispers, but this time they seemed to be calls coming directly from the bridge. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and fear, he approached the structure, feeling the atmosphere change. The temperature dropped, and a sense of discomfort settled in his chest. At the center of the bridge, he heard disturbing children's laughter, and looking around, he saw small footprints in the mud, but no one was there. Soon, spectral figures of children appeared, running and playing on the bridge, their movements stiff and mechanical as if trapped in a repetitive cycle. Their faces turned towards him, but their eyes were empty, filled with infinite sadness. With horror, he realized that the bridge was not just a passage, but a portal between the world of the living and the dead, where the souls of the children were trapped, eternally reliving their last moments. Feeling a malevolent presence around him, he tried to flee, but every movement was difficult, as if the bridge was trying to hold him back. Finally, he forced himself to run, followed by the children's laughter and whispers until he reached the end of the bridge. Although silence returned when he left the bridge behind, he knew that what he had seen that night would never leave him. The images of the children and the terror he experienced were etched in his mind, and he understood that he had crossed paths with something far more sinister, and that was only the beginning. After that night, he knew nothing would ever be the same. The fear of the bridge haunted him, but he also felt a strange compulsion to return. Determined to understand what was happening and possibly help the souls trapped there, he returned to the bridge the next night. With a more powerful flashlight, he called out to the children, offering help. The children's figures appeared again, but when he tried to approach, an invisible barrier stopped him. The children seemed trapped in an eternal cycle of pain, unable to respond to him. Suddenly, he became aware of a dark and malevolent presence, something that wasn't of the children, but that controlled them. The sense of evil was palpable, and he began to realize that there was something much more sinister behind those apparitions. His flashlight failed, plunging him into darkness, and he felt the presence with full force, emanating pure evil. The children, now in erratic movements and filled with terror, seemed to plead for help, but he knew there was nothing he could do. The presence drew closer, sucking the air around him, almost consuming him. With a final effort, he managed to move and ran, feeling the presence almost dragging him back into the darkness. When he finally left the bridge, the oppressive feeling diminished, but he knew the danger had not yet passed. He had crossed a dangerous line, and whatever was on the bridge was now aware of his presence and wouldn't let him go so easily. The escape from the bridge was a desperate race against an invisible and oppressive presence. Fear drove him forward as the trail through the woods seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the forest conspired to stop him. Every second seemed to distort, and the voices of the children, now distorted and agonizing, followed him, making him doubt his sanity. At one point, he stumbled, realizing that the ground beneath his feet was moving, as if the forest itself was alive and trying to pull him back to the bridge. Feeling the malevolent presence approaching, he forced himself to get up and continue running, knowing that to give up would mean being consumed by that force. When he finally saw the end of the trail, the path seemed to twist, trying to prevent him from escaping. With a final effort, he hurled himself towards the opening, feeling something cold touch the back of his neck, but refusing to look back. As he crossed the edge of the forest, the malevolent presence didn't follow, and he stopped, gasping for breath, on the dirt road leading to the village. Although the voices and whispers had disappeared, he knew that wasn't the end. He felt that the bridge, a portal to something sinister, had marked his soul. And no matter where he went, whatever was on that bridge wouldn't leave him alone, shadowing him like a dark presence that could never be dissipated. The return to the village was shrouded in suffocating silence. Upon reaching his cabin, he leaned against the door, trying to push away the fear, but he knew something had changed forever. The village, once familiar and welcoming, now felt uncomfortable and strange, with darker and denser shadows. What he had seen on the bridge had marked him deeply, and he couldn't ignore or forget it. In the days that followed, he tried to resume his routine, but nightmares and strange occurrences haunted him. Objects moved on their own, doors were left ajar, and he felt he was no longer alone. The distorted voices and laughter of the children pursued him both in his dreams and in reality. The villagers began to notice his change. Once confident, he now seemed on the brink of collapse, avoided by everyone. Losing control of his life, he realized that the bridge had brought something into his existence, something he couldn't push away with logic or reason. Consumed by fear, he decided to return to the bridge to confront whatever was there. He knew he had to try to end it, but he also feared it was too late. The bridge had marked him deeply, and he felt that part of him would always be tied to that place, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. Determined to face whatever was on the bridge, he prepared for his final journey. However, the feeling that something was watching and waiting never left him. He knew that whatever was on the bridge was an ancient and powerful force, something he had brought into his life and from which he couldn't escape. On that last night, he made his way to the bridge with a heavy heart, knowing his life would never be the same. The forest was eerily silent, and the path to the bridge seemed longer and darker. Upon arrival, the full moon illuminated the old structure, and the whispers echoed more intensely around him. He felt the malevolent presence again, but determined, he called out to the children, wanting to help them. The children began to appear, pale and indistinct, watching him with sadness and despair. As he tried to approach, he felt the malevolent presence preventing any attempt to free them. It was then that he realized the truth. The bridge was a portal between the world of the living and the dead, and the children were trapped there, used by the malevolent presence that fed on their suffering. With sadness, he understood that he couldn't free them. The curse of the bridge was ancient and powerful, something he couldn't fight. The children disappeared into the darkness, and the malevolent presence, satisfied, let him go, knowing he was already marked by the bridge. Back in the village, he accepted that his life had changed forever. The bridge had marked him, and that mark would never disappear. He became a silent guardian, responsible for watching over the dark secret of the bridge, aware that he was connected to it in a way he couldn't break. He accepted his fate, knowing that the Bridge of Whispers wasn't just a legend. It was his reality, one he would live with until the end of his days, carrying the burden of knowing what lurked in the shadows. The bridge had become part of him, and he part of the bridge.